יש לי דיליי, אני בג'טלג, היה לי אוברווייט, קניתי הנבג, כתבתי מיילים, הוספתי JPEG, אני לא בפוקוס, תוסיף לי השטג, סווג. אומייגאד, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. לא, אני בסטרס, כל הקטע של העברית מתפספס. סיריוסלי, יש לי תחושה שזה קורס. קייסס, זה לא ביג דיל, זה מבאס. תראו, כולם היום עובדים 24/7, בלי הרבה תשוקה, עם המון פשן, נונסטופ חולמים על רילוקיישן, על אקזיט מפואר, על סטארט-אפ ניישן. יוצאים לדייטים, לאיזה רנדבו, בלופ אחד, מדז'בו לדז'בו, שותים שוטים, צ'ייסרים, דרינקים עם כולם, בונים על אפי אאוור, על הנגובר חינם. בין בלנס, בין ההיי ללו, חיים ריאליטי שואו, תאמינו לי, I know וזה להביא, hello, כבר הגיע הזמן that we speak the language of the Hebrew man. אומייגאד, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. המקיף יהיה ב-AIG, הקבצים הם בגיף או ב-BMP.
ברוכים הבאים. On behalf of Ivrit B'Merkaz, Hebrew at the Center, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations focused on Hebrew, Ivrit. My name is Arnie Winchell, and I'm founding president of Ivrit B'Merkaz. Ivrit B'Merkaz was founded 10 years ago with the mission to revolutionize the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We chose this focus in service of a vision of a world where Hebrew literacy is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to a thriving Jewish identity and global Jewish community. When we set out as a small group of Hebrew language educators and enthusiasts to disrupt the status quo, we envisioned our contribution to this Salon, this dream, would come through addressing what has been a lack of success in effectively giving the gift of proficiency in Hebrew to Jews throughout the diaspora. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Through Sicha, we are hoping to engage a wider audience in appreciating the value of investing in Hebrew and in joining us in disrupting the status quo. We will be holding 2 more Sichot conversations in the current series. One later this week on Thursday, May 21, and the 4th on Sunday, May 31. Please check our website for details, hebrewathecenter.org. We want to thank Hebrew College for co-hosting today's program, the second in the series. We will be joined by Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld, president of the college, at the end of the program. We are privileged today to welcome Jeremy Benstein and Avraham Infeld in conversation, a tribal language for a global people. Dr. Benstein is an educator, author, and Hebrew lover with a BA in linguistics from Harvard, a master's degree in Judaic studies, and a doctorate in cultural anthropology. Originally from the Midwest, he moved to Israel over 35 years ago and helped found the Heschel Center for Sustainability in Tel Aviv. Currently the managing editor of 929 English, Tanakh, Age-Old Text, New Perspectives. His most recent book is Hebrew Roots, Jewish Routes, a tribal language in a global world. Avraham Infeld is a well-known Jewish educator, author, and leader who founded Melitz, an Israeli education nonprofit that fosters Jewish identity, served as the president of Hillel, and was the first international director of Birthright. Born in South Africa and raised in a Zionist family, Avraham made an aliyah to Israel and studied Jewish history and Bible at the Hebrew University and law at Tel Aviv University. He is the recipient of Hebrew University's prestigious Samuel Rothberg Prize for Jewish Education, Hillel Renaissance Award, and recently received the Sylvan Adams Bonnet Zion Lifetime Achievement Prize, recognizing Anglos who have made a major contribution to the state of Israel. His book, A Passion for a People, launched in November 2017. Today, Avraham is engaged in a variety of projects focused on Jewish peoplehood and tikkun olam, repairing the world. A most compelling storyteller and inspiring speaker, he travels the world and shares his metaphor describing a strong and stable Jewish identity, the five-legged table. One leg, of course, is Hebrew. I now want to introduce Rabbi Andrew Ergis, the new CEO of Hebrew at the Center, who will moderate this series. For more than 20 years, Rabbi Ergis has held leadership roles across the spectrum of Jewish education, from Jewish camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in his personal life. For the past 3 years as chair of the board of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture in North America. I really hope you all enjoyed this interesting conversation. And now I will turn it over to Andrew. Thank you.
Arnie, thank you so much. And a special thanks to you and the rest of the staff who are deeply busy today, gearing up for a series of complimentary online trainings for Hebrew teachers and leaders throughout North America and the globe. I know for our launch event at 4 o'clock Eastern today, we already have over 300 Hebrew teachers and leaders signed up. Jeremy, Avraham, it is wonderful to see you and to have you join us in this important conversation. I'd love to start just to hear a little more about your own Hebrew journey, in particular, your Hebrew journeys before you came to Israel. So Jeremy, if you want to start, and then we'll turn it over to Avraham.
Okay. Age before beauty, I guess. So in thinking about my Hebrew journey, as you put it, I would say that I have about 4 different tachanot, stations on the way before getting to Israel. One, I think, is the heritage, the example of my grandparents. My grandfather was a conservative rabbi, Rabbi Morris Adler, and his wife Goldie Adler. Both of them spoke a beautiful Hebrew. And my grandmother regaled me with stories of her teaching Hebrew school in New York City in the 1920s, I guess, late 20s, early 30s. And she would, as a prize to well-behaved students, take class to Yankee Stadium to see Babe Ruth play. So as a young baseball fan, I thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. Later on, I went to Camp Ramah in Canada for a couple of years, and that certainly is a Hebrew-rich environment. And I have to say shout out to one particular book, a book called How the Hebrew Language Grew by a guy named Edward Horowitz, a Jewish educator. And it's a very a surprising sort of book because it's sort of like an 8th grade Sunday school textbook almost, but it is chock full with just amazing, interesting things about the development of Hebrew and Hebrew words and things like that. And it just captured my fancy such that I ended up studying linguistics in college, and I even did my senior thesis on the binyanim, on the morphophonemics of Hebrew. And so it was from there straight to Aliyah. So that's where the journey, one part of the journey ended and the other part began.
That thesis sounds like a real barn burner. I think I'll wait for the movie. Avraham, tell us a little bit about your Hebrew journey.
It's difficult for me to talk about Hebrew as a journey. My life has been a journey in which Hebrew was there from the very beginning. I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, to a very Zionist family. Neither of my parents were Israeli, although my mother had studied for 3 years at the Seminar Levinsky in Jerusalem in Tel Aviv in the 20s in order to be a Hebrew teacher. And South Africa was a very, very tribal society. Everyone I knew in South Africa was a member of a tribe. It could have been a whole variety of black tribes, the 3 or 4 white tribes, or a member of one of the 2 Jewish tribes, either the Litvaks or the few non-Litvaks. The sense of tribalhood that we had in South Africa, the sense of belonging to a tribe which was all-encompassing in your lifestyle, made Hebrew an important part of that. I do not recall my father talking to me in English unless he was furious about something. Most of the conversation was in Ivrit. I came to Israel at the age of 16 and a half, fluent in the language. It was just a natural part of my being a Jew. It has remained so until this very day.
Thank you both. I would love to just jump right into our topic, and we obviously the topic of today's conversation is a tribal language and a global people. You both came to Israel from different parts of the broader Jewish diaspora, certainly coming from what in Hebrew we call the Anglo-Saxon community. So I presume at some point your ancestors were Anglo-Saxons involved in all types of pillage and war. We began with an interesting contemporary Israeli video about the influence of English on contemporary modern Hebrew. I'm wondering if you can start us off. One, why is the Anglo-Saxon community in general and the American community in particular so challenged by Hebrew? And what's Israel doing in terms of ensuring that Hebrew serves as a counterweight against this global language called English?
Avraham,
First of all, if you were to ask me, I think the Americans are challenged about English as well, but that's not the subject for today. Americans have a problem with foreign languages altogether. They also have a different understanding of what it means to be a Jew. A very, very clear, and to my mind, mistaken way of looking at being Jewish. Not their fault. They are several generations into this understanding what it means to be a Jew. And with that understanding of being a Jew, Hebrew is really not very relevant and has had major difficulties in becoming relevant to the American Jewish community. In many ways, it is the way in which I understood Latin in the Catholic world, accepting that the Catholics were wise enough to get rid of it. They did understand eventually that God knows other languages as well, and you do not have to talk to him in any specific language. So I believe that the problem lies not in the problem of Hebrew. The problem lies in the understanding of what does it mean to be a Jew. This title that we've stolen for tonight's talk, that we've stolen actually from Jeremy's book, A Tribal Language for a Global People, is really very, very incisive and descriptive of what this is all about. We have to recognize that this is a tribal language, a language of a particular tribe. A tribe is an expansion of a family. A family becomes a tribe, and a tribe becomes a people. Language moves with it in that growth. When you change the understanding of what you are as a Jew, then it becomes far more difficult to understand why having a distinct language or not. Just one example I want to give you. Jacob arrives in the land of Israel. Lavan comes to meet with him. They have some kind of an argument and decide to go different ways. They separate their paths, and all of a sudden, in the Torah, you find the one single word which is not in Hebrew. They build a pile of stones, a testimonial pile of stones, which is called, Jacob says, it says, and Laban called it Yegarsa Haduta, and Yaakov called it Gal Ed, which is an exact translation, but in two different languages. They've decided to go their own way, to be distinctive as people. The moment you make a decision to be as distinctive as a people, language becomes central. That's the lesson of that meeting, of that parting of the way between Jacob and Laban. You want your distinctiveness, you want to be who you are, look at language. Because language, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as we go on, language is not only a lashon, a way in which you communicate, it's also a safa. And if you are distinct, you have a culture, the way to transfer that culture from one generation to another demands a particular language.
Okay. I see that Avraham is wearing the hat of the Jewish educator, so I will play, as we say in Hebrew, contra, with more of the linguistic point of view. As Avraham mentioned, indeed, Americans are a little bit more challenged when it comes to the multilingual capabilities. And I think it stems from a number of things. Certainly geographic isolation. If you grow up in Central Europe, you don't have the luxury of speaking just one language. I think it also has to do with an American sort of cultural ideology. And as Avram put it, this whole question of how one conceives of one's identity, right? Even though no one really speaks very much about the melting pot as the overriding metaphor for American culture, it is not the thing to do to be so distinctive and speak a completely separate language. I mean, if Jews want to fit in, they're not going to emphasize difference either on the linguistic front or behavioral front or anything else, right? So a language is definitely embedded in identity, as identity is expressed in and embedded in language. And so if you're not interested in developing a distinctive identity or perpetuating that identity, then you certainly won't be interested or have kind of the psychological bandwidth to invest the resources of time and energy needed to develop the language. But as you pointed out, Andrew, so I mean, Israel is also dealing with, I wouldn't say a threat to Hebrew by any stretch, and we can talk about all the sort of cutesy examples that were brought, that Hatikva Shesh uses in their song. I think Israel is alive and kicking and experiencing economic globalization just like any other country. And, you know, the French sort of need to defend their linguistic heritage, and just about any other country that watches Netflix and uses Windows in their computer and Facebook and everything else. So that's a global issue, and Israel and Hebrew is dealing with it as it is. But in the same way, other linguistic minorities or other, you know, religious identities in the States are also dealing with questions of cultural distinctiveness, right? I mean, what are called the heritage languages. If you're Italian American or if you're Hispanic, to what extent can you perpetuate that if you're living in a very dominant and overriding English-speaking culture? So just like we always say, the Jews are sort of just like everybody else, but in this case, even more so.
The recent Pew study that did a portrait of American Jewry actually asked a few questions about Hebrew, and one of the indicators appeared to be that having the capacity to speak Hebrew, not to decode, is also a proxy for religious observance. I don't know if it's causal or spurious, but that seems to be the perception of many in the American Jewish community. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, especially as we see more and more Jews in America kind of distancing not only from Israel, but also from sort of religiosity, is the association of spoken Hebrew with religious observance. Does that help us in the case of advancing Hebrew, or does that hinder the case for advancing Hebrew if American Jews see themselves first and foremost as part of a religious community rather than a broader Jewish civilization?
I would have
Go
to
ahead, Jeremy.
Okay. I would say that is potentially a negative metric or characteristic, because I mean, just ironic. It's funny, we're having this conversation about Hebrew in North America with these two Altacockers who live in Israel, right? I mean, you're an Altacocker who lives in America, so you have more rights to that story. But from the point of view of Israel, like the more you study the development of Israeli Hebrew, it's amazing how much specifically the language and even just the word Hebrew, tarbut ivrit, is a signifier, in some respects a proxy, to use that word, for rebelliousness, for secular Jewish culture. If you want to talk about secular Israeli culture that's based in the land and based in pioneer, you talk about tarbut ivrit, connected to specifically the spoken Hebrew language. So there's something almost ironic about the idea that spoken Hebrew in the United States is, as you say, kind of linked in that way to religious observance. I assume that means that the more religious you are, or the more time you spend in a religious day school, then the better your Hebrew is. And if you don't have that possibility, you won't have good Hebrew, and because you're not in that religious environment. And that is, I think, unfortunate. I would love to see people investing time in developing a secular Jewish identity that embraces Hebrew specifically, because it has that whole side to it. One of the things I try to emphasize in my book is that there isn't just one Hebrew. We go in Hebrew and Hebrew language, and William Chomsky in his book called it the eternal language. I would call it the eternal languages, plural, because there are different Hebrews out there, and spoken Hebrew is one thing. And if you just focus on spoken Hebrew, you'll probably be really good at, ordering falafel, or maybe being able to understand shtisel or fauda without reading the subtitles. But it'll be hard to make your way in a siddur, in a prayer book, or reading the Tanakh. On the other hand, if you focus on those things, then you won't have necessarily the skills to deal with Israeli, secular culture, or secularized Hebrew. So I think it's, I would like to see a sort of decoupling of Hebrew as one area of life, and obviously they can reinforce each other, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so totally causally linked like that.
Jeremy, I think it's even more complicated than that. I think there is a big danger that Hebrew is associated primarily with the world of prayer, primarily with the world of religion. Just the story I always tell of my first visit to Omaha, Nebraska. I get invited. I'd never heard of Nebraska. I get invited to give a lecture. I arrive on a Sunday morning. They tell me, Avraham, your lecture's only tonight. Would you like to visit our Hebrew school? I said, I'd love to visit your Hebrew school. So they take me to a building that's situated right behind a synagogue and has on the wall a sign which says religious school. And I walk into a classroom, and I see a teacher surrounded by a group of 18 or 20 children, 11 or 12 years old. And what is she doing? She's trying to teach these children how to read a language they don't understand. I remember looking at the faces of those kids and seeing the suffering of my people. It was amazing. I said to the teacher, I said, why are you doing this? You're teaching them to read something they don't understand. And her response to me was, Avraham, you don't understand. In a year or two, they're going to have a bar or bat mitzvah, and they need to pray in Hebrew. I called over one of those kids who I'll never forget because of his beautiful Hebrew name, Timothy. I said, Timothy, why do you have to pray in Hebrew? And Timothy's immediate, natural, sensible response was, because God does not understand English. I don't think you can underestimate how that message gets across in a very serious way without our even realizing it. God understands French and German and Korean and Arabic. We don't pray because in Hebrew because God doesn't understand. But nor does Hebrew only refer to the secular world. The difference between a Lashon and a Safa, as I said before, the Lashon is used for communication, but languages are much more. They convey Jewish concepts. They convey cultural concepts in all languages, cultural concepts from one generation to another. We deal with tzedakah, we don't deal with charity. There's a big difference between the two. The connections between Kodem and Kadima are deeply come from the language. There is no Kadima, there is no future without a tie to the past. You need the language in order to be able to transfer those cultural concepts. I really found it amazing at the places where I saw Hebrew being taught in America, whereby we're in the schools which were associated with religious institutions, or by Ulpanim were created by Israelis. I remember walking into an Ulpan class in Baltimore, Maryland, and watching a shaliach teaching kids how to order food in a restaurant. I spent the rest of my time in Baltimore looking for a waiter who understood Hebrew. Hebrew became irrelevant on all levels for the people who are learning. It's neither a way in which they're going to order food, nor is it a way in which you have to pray. It is the language of this people. And until we accept that, we are not going to be able to change the relevance of Hebrew in the United States of America or in the world today. But America is the biggest challenge of all.
I'm curious if we can add the layer, and obviously the two of you, as was mentioned, are both joining us from Israel, and it was certainly another key element of your identities. How is it possible to differentiate the relationship between Hebrew and Israel? And sort of, in particular, given more and more distancing, especially with the newer generation, a younger generation, away from Israel. And Hebrew is a connector to that broader global Jewish people. Like how does that variable play a role in our work of trying to advance Hebrew in North America?
You want to field that one?
Well, I don't know if it's an answer to the question, but my late father said, if you've got something to say, say it. If it doesn't answer the question, it's a sign you were asked the wrong question. And there is, on the same day, a very famous Rav passed away in Israel. Rav Salon Oyabach, a great Talmid Chacham, who had written many Sheilot v'Tshuvot. His was the largest funeral in Israel until that time. Menachem Begin's funeral was the only one to ever pass it. Over 300,000 people attended this rabbi's funeral, who had spent his entire life writing in one language only. That same night, by chance, in Tel Aviv, Aviv Geffen's first big, major public performance took place with well over 100,000 people participating. Aviv Geffen has never written a word of a song in any language other than Hebrew. And Hebrew is very much a part of whom he is. Both of these worlds, the modern secular world of modern Israeli culture. Hebrew is central to. It makes no difference how many words are added in English. That presentation that I enjoyed very much at the beginning was funny, was amusing. It's not dangerous to Hebrew in Israel. Hebrew is very, very well installed in Israel. But those two worlds, deeply immersed in Hebrew, and 90% of American Jewry can't relate to either one of them. Now that frightens me, because Hebrew is really immersed in different worlds of being Jewish. And if you want to retain a Jewish identity, Hebrew must become a part. When a Jew tried to speak German, he ended up speaking Yiddish. And when he tried to speak Spanish, he ended up speaking Ladino. When he tried to speak Arabic, he came up with a version of a mixture between Arabic and Hebrew. Americans succeed in speaking English without a single word necessarily being in Hebrew. That is a real danger to my mind. I'm not dreaming of having an American Jewish community conversing fluently in Hebrew. It's not going to happen. But building an identity in which the language is a part, not only of your synagogue life, but of your Jewish community life. Hebrew not only has to be taught, but Hebrew has to be educated towards. Teaching of the language is a very, very simple profession. You can learn how to teach Hebrew. To educate someone to learn Hebrew is far more difficult.
Yeah, I think you touched on some interesting points there, and it's interesting to kind of connect us back to the previous question, because you said, well, is it problematic that Hebrew has become a proxy for religious observance? In other words, those two things are coupled together, and the more of one, the more religious you are, then the more Hebrew you are, and if you're not religious, then you don't have Hebrew. And here you're saying, well, if you want a connection to Israel, then you might want to, in fact, invest in Hebrew, because that is indeed the language of the country here, though, of course, you can get around in English. But so then you're saying, well, there are people who aren't religious, and so then Hebrew, you don't need Hebrew for that. And then there are people who are a little bit distanced or estranged, or however, for whatever reason, not connected to Israel. So maybe you don't need Hebrew for that. But the fact is that everywhere you look in all the different corners of Jewish identity, Hebrew's there. Hebrew is part of it. Hebrew is, so if you want to be religious but non-Zionist, so you need Hebrew. If you want to be Zionist but not religious, so you need Hebrew. If you want to connect to Jewish culture, whether it be literature or philosophy in the Middle Ages, well, Hebrew is a good tool to have. One of the things that I try to point out in the book is that if you think of Jewishness as a place, right? I mean, most of us haven't flown anywhere recently because of the situation. It's like to fly to a foreign country. Then, if you're a tourist in that place and you don't speak the language, so there's a limit to how at home you can feel or how much you can actually get to know what's really going on in that place. And if you really fall in love with a place, if you love French culture, then you're going to invest in French. And if you want to go tour the culinary wonders of Italy, then certainly boning up on your Italian is going to help. And if you don't have those, then you just remain a tourist kind of surfing the surface, as it were, of those cultures. So if you think of Jewishness as a place like that, yeah, there are a lot of great translations of things connected to Israel, things connected to Jewish tradition, Jewish literature, etc. But without speaking the language, you will always remain a tourist. You will always remain somewhere on the surface. And so again, it goes back to identity. If the identity is important, then the language and the tools that the language can give you are important. And here, I would echo something that Avraham said. It's not necessarily about fluency in conversational Hebrew, etc., but it's more about connecting to to, I focus on the roots, like taking it from the grammar, like that he mentioned, Avraham mentioned before, it's tzedakah, that it's different than charity. And to know that it's different than charity, you have to realize that tzedakah comes from tzedek, which means justice. And then you have this sort of value concept that you can attach to a Hebrew word. And there are dozens and dozens of words like that that express something that is, not necessarily completely unique, but it's really something special about our Jewishness that is just not captured in any other language, including English. So,
Jeremy, thank you very much, because I think the way you reacted to what I said, you pinpointed to me that Hebrew may be the only connection between all of these various Jewish identities. And if you want to have a single Jewish people, irrespective of how they interpret Jewish memories, language is the conduit for whatever interpretation you give to Jewish memories. So it can also not only be a conduit to Jewish memories, it can be a linkage between Jews, which I find today something that we desperately need. Hebrew could be the answer to that because it belongs to all areas of Jewish life and to none of them only.
exactly.
So I want to respond to something that you just said, but first I want to encourage everyone who's joining us to join in the conversation. You can use the Q&A function to post questions either to the group or specifically to either Avraham and Jeremy. And in a moment, we'll transition to some of those questions. But I want to go back to, I want to challenge something you said, Avraham, about that it's something that belongs to us all. And while I very much agree with you, I sometimes get a sense both from diaspora Jews in particular in the United States, but also from Israelis as well, that Hebrew is really something that they've taken ownership of, that the rich Hebraic culture that had existed in the United States, kind of those people all left and Hebrew got taken over by the Israelis. I'm wondering how, every time an Israeli corrects someone's Hebrew or talks poorly, not necessarily about South African accented Hebrew, but American accented Hebrew, if in fact they're undermining this idea that this language as a component of identity really belongs to us all. What do you think?
I think you're right in many ways because Zionism taught that what they succeeded in doing, perhaps more than any other success they had, was taking a dead language and reviving it. That is not what happened. What Zionism did was they took a living language and turned it into a spoken language. Now, that's a very important battle that has got to happen in Israel education, in the recognition that we did not take a dead language. It's not accidental that Hebrew is the language. It was not created by the Israeli or for the Israeli. What the Israeli did, it took a living language and turned it into a conversational language and did very, very well at doing that. And there is an organization in Israel that is credited with the approval of new words in English, in Hebrew, because they don't exist anywhere else. The word chashmal for electricity, they chose as the word from some of the visions of Yechezkel, of sparks, etc. And they made that refer to electricity today. It is an unbelievable task of turning a living language into a spoken language. I want Jews to share in the language, not necessarily in this part of the living language or the spoken part of the living language, but in the recognition that you cannot read a clear, deeply Jewish text without knowing Hebrew. You cannot even read an Aramaic text without knowing Hebrew. I'll just, one more story I have to tell. I was a real chutzpah kid in a very secular home with a secular father who every Shabbat, right after lunch, used to take down a Talmud, a Gemara, and learn for 2 hours Gemara with me on Shabbat without covering his head and with a cigarette in his mouth. And we came to that segment which teaches about God giving Moses 2 Torahs when Moses climbed Mount Sinai. He gave him a written Torah and an oral Torah. I was a little chutzpah kid. I just said to my dad, I don't understand. How long would it have taken God to write the oral Torah? He built a whole world in 6 days. He could have written oral Torah in 17 seconds. Why? My father gets up, and I was a little bit of a heavy kid, picks me up, gives me a hug and a kiss. He says, never, ever forget that question. Ask yourself that question every single day. Well, if you want to take a journey in re-oralizing Jewish tradition, in re-oralizing Jewish law, it cannot be done without Hebrew.
Okay. I have, just to that question of, you know, to whom does Hebrew belong? Is it more of an Israeli thing, or can we say that it's really something to the entire Jewish people? I understand the feeling of Jews in the diaspora feeling that they are, they have an inferior position. Of course, they don't live in total immersion with the language like Israelis do. It's clearly you can't compete on that level. Although I have very fond memories of the Jewish summer camps that I have gone to, both Camp Ramah and Tel Yehuda, as a young Judean, where it wasn't quite as much Hebrew immersion, but it was certainly a part of the camp culture. And certainly one of the tragedies of this year of Jewish camps suffer, and that's going to be a big blow to Jewish education, because we need those totalizing environments. But let's face it, I mean, Hebrew and any part of Jewish tradition belongs to whoever wants to claim it. It's there. It's there's a famous midrash about the Torah being given in the desert, because just like the desert is hefker, it doesn't belong to anybody. It's not one of the tribal possessions. So you can't say it goes to this person, that person. So all of Jewish tradition is like that, and certainly Hebrew within it. And so I have friends and colleagues in the Jewish linguistic world that talk about if you can't have Hebrew immersion, you can have Hebrew infusion, right? That you might not speak Hebrew fluently or have that as your main conversational language, but you can expose yourself and acquire enough Hebrew, those nuggets of knowledge of particular value concepts and words that are really captured by Hebrew to infuse your own identity and your own Jewishness. And that's one way of connecting to Hebrew. And I don't think there should be any kind of, I don't know, global competition or holier than thou, Hebrewer than thou in that world. Everyone has to, forge their own path and create their own personal connection to how it works for them and contributes to their own life journey. And wait a minute, Avraham has been telling stories. Let me tell a story too, just about Hebrew functions. My wife took me to Italy on a surprise trip for my birthday a month before coronavirus hit, so it was good timing. And it was Friday afternoon, and things were winding down for us, not for the Romans. But we were walking through a market back to our place to get ready for Shabbat, and saw some beautiful men's shirts. And I don't buy very many clothes, but I thought, well, okay, it's my birthday trip, and these are beautiful shirts, and there was a good price and everything. So I go in and I try one on, and this lovely, elderly, very Italian saleswoman, tells me that, well, it's 3 for this price, and you can get 3 different colors. And so I start talking to my wife Annabelle in Hebrew, of course, to decide, should we do it? Is it too much money? Should we try to bargain her down, etc.? So we ended up paying the price, and she looks at us and is happy to wrap us our shirts. And then she says, Shabbat Shalom, because she heard us speaking Hebrew. That was our secret language because we spoke that. We thought but I don't know if she spoke Hebrew, but we certainly knew that we were Jewish, and she wanted to let us know that she was also Jewish. She was one of the tribe. She wanted to make that connection, and the only way, the best, and really the way she could do it was with two simple Hebrew words that said so much about the connection between us. And so Hebrew is there as well.
Thank you both for the stories, and a Yom Holedet Sameach to you,
Months ago.
Jeremy. I want to surface some of the questions that our participants have begun to post, and once again, I want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Both Steve Littman and Sigalit Davis asked both sides of a similar question, and that's the relationship between a modern spoken Hebrew and traditional texts. I certainly know that if you ask your average Israeli what teku means, they'll tell you, oh, well, that's when at the end of the soccer game, both teams have the same score, but may not necessarily know where that acronym stems from. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between these more traditional texts in the modern language. Sigalit is interested in a very large sector of modern Israelis, many of whom might define themselves as secular or chiloni, who didn't have the same textual traditions that the early speakers of modern Hebrew had. And then Steve's interested on some of the cultural manifestations, in particular music, and other cultural artists like the Banais, who are bringing to the contemporary Israeli cultural scene some of these texts which have been distant or foreign to much of the Israeli secular community. How's that impacting Hebrew and identity within Israel?
That's a great question. Thanks, Stephen Sigalit. One of the things that I develop at some length in the book is really trying to explore, again, this whole question of Hebrew. To what extent is it one language? And we can look at all these things as the phenomenon of one system of signifiers that everyone who's part of it can understand. And to what extent has there been some sort of a bifurcation, a distance that's grown? And I mean, I see it, I've raised my kids here, and even though they had a fairly warm Jewish household, they went to a regular secular Israeli school system, and they can read Tanakh because they've had to study it for 10 years. And when it's up to them to just open the book, most of it is very, very difficult for them. So there is a distance that has grown for many reasons, if only for the fact that Hebrew is a living language, right? Living things change. They change over time. And Hebrew, it almost seems like Hebrew had all these pent-up energies over the years. Avraham said it was transforming a living language, a living literary language, to a spoken language. That is true. But once you get Hebrew out of the Beit Midrash and onto the street, then it develops all kinds of energies and dynamics. So there is that distance. I'm reminded of the famous leaders of the Hashomer Hatzair movement, Chazan and Yari. And they were talking about, raising up a generation of proud, rebellious, secular Jews. And he said, we wanted to raise a generation of apikorsim, right? People who would know a lot, but wouldn't accept it, wouldn't be, believers in religious Judaism. But we ended up with amaratzim, right? People who didn't have that knowledge and were just ignorant of all those sources. That was what they said about their own followers. So on the one hand, there is this problem of I would say a widespread lack of depth of knowledge of all the sources and amazing richness of the historical Hebrew language. That's true. But as you point out, it's there. It's just there for the taking. There's nothing. It's not like it's something that's difficult to access. And one amazing example is exactly what you said about Israeli popular music. It's not just the Banais. It's Kobi Oz, and it's a whole string of people. There are in fact very few regular secular Israeli artists who haven't done some song or included some lyrics from traditional Jewish sources, just because that is the makor, the wellspring, spring that never goes dry for sources of metaphor and poetic inspiration and historic allusion and all those things. And so it's become much more part, it's kind of this almost like, I'm thinking of a geological metaphor, right? Where there are these, minor eruptions and then things solidify and maybe become petrified, but then they get, re-melted again through the heat of cultural transformation and pop out again somewhere else. I don't think, I'm not worried in that respect. I do think that one thing, American Jews have to deal with the questions of Jewish identity and Hebrew education, et cetera, that we've been mentioning. And Israeli Jews also have to deal with this need to connect to Hebrew and to those sources, again, not necessarily as part of a religious authority, but there's also been a huge growth over the past decade or two of pluralistic yeshivot or even secular yeshivot, people returning to learn from sources simply because that is our cultural heritage and not necessarily be as a source of authoritative religious observance. So that's also really there.
Look, I really believe that there is a problem, and a lot of Israelis are desperately afraid of religious authoritarianism, and rightfully so, because many of the Orthodox establishment in Israel are very authoritarian. And that's why I like the story that I told about reoralizing. What you've described about language happens to culture, not only to language. Culture develops and changes, and it develops naturally. It doesn't develop naturally when you have a fear of the roots. Somehow, to my mind, political reasons, we have created a fear of Jewish roots in some of the use of the Hebrew language. So that's a problem in Israel that I think educators in Israel have to get involved in and help people get over. And it's happening. The number of Israeli singers and musicians that are getting involved in the learning of ancient piyutim in order to put them to modern music and for them to be a part of modern life is amazing. It's happening all the time. We've got to get over these two fears. The fear on the one hand of being Jewish is going to be completely tightening of you, or holding you back, not releasing you. And this fear of saying, I know so little, I don't even know where to begin. We've got to be able to take that step. When we last spoke, you told us you were going to ask us, we're running out of time, so I'm rushing to have you ask us if we have a favorite Hebrew word. Andrew, I don't know if you remember that. And I'd like to give you, as usual, instead of giving you one, I want to give you two of my favorite Hebrew words.
I narrowed it down to 4, so.
What? Is Andrew still with us? I can't see
Yes, I'm still with you. I
was waiting breath to hear what word you chose, Avraham.
A little ayefet, my favorite Hebrew word.
What is it?
What are your 2 favorite Hebrew words, Avraham?
Lehitahev and mashber. And why? Everybody in the Christian Protestant world knows about falling in love. All Americans spoke about falling in love. Everybody in the audience over here knows about falling in love. I don't understand that phrase. Love is not something that you fall into. Love is something in which you rise, which you grow. It's the exact opposite of falling. And you have it in a Christian Protestant society because of the original sin of man. How do you say to fall in love in Hebrew? Lehitahev, a unique grammatical form called hitpa'el, which is always reflexive. Falling in love depends on both sides. It takes 2 to tangle. It's like the distinction between lichtov, to write, and lehitkatev, to correspond. It's very important that we understand that. We don't fall in love. We mitahev. We learn that from our language. And the second word is mashber. What is a mashber? A mashber is a crisis. And we Jews are living in a crisis of identity. But the term mashber originally referred to a birthing stool, an instrument, a stool on which women gave birth. We are in a mashber. It can either be a crisis or it can be a renaissance. I hope we develop a renaissance.
There's actually, thank you. And if we have a moment, we'll come back to you, Jeremy, for your 4 Hebrew words. Lawrence Grossman asked the question of how do we explain the value of Hebrew to most American Jews? And I think Leah Meir, one of our other participants, kind of surfaces this in our particular moment in the mashber, the crisis that we find ourselves in with the coronavirus. As was said earlier, there's very little Jewish camping that's going to happen this summer. There's going to be tremendous financial strains on day schools, on supplementary schools. Many JCCs are having to significantly reduce their program. What do you suggest we do to help set priorities and move this agenda forward for an American community that's likely not to be in the choir that we're preaching to right now? In addition to buying both of your books.
Yeah, that's taken for granted. But the coronavirus attacked all of us as human beings, all of us as individuals, all of us in a global sense, all of us in a global world. It made no distinction between any of us, Arab or Jew, Ashkenazi or Sfaradi, Italian or Chinese. What is the interesting response? Go home. Go to your room. Go back to being you, and then come back into the global world as a part of being you, your collective you. I learned from the corona reaction, it's time for the Jews to take a step back towards their own narrative, their own language, their own stories, their own values. Not in order to run away from the global world, but to come into this global world with a commitment to universal ends, but through particular means. Those particular means demand the Hebrew language.
Well, I don't think I could say that better myself, but I will say something. I will add anyway, I think one of the issues, especially with the American public, is that there's this feeling that sometimes particularistic identities can be this sort of unnecessary weight, or this thing that stops you from being human, right? Why can't we just be, all right, you know, identities are the source of difference. They're the source of conflict, right? If we just want to get along and promote peace in the world, you know, I mean, on some level, it's the vision of John Lennon's song, Imagine. And when I tell people that even though I love John Lennon and his music, and I think that he did a lot of great things, I think that particular song is borderline fascist. They look at me like I'm crazy, because I think it's borderline fascist because it talks about erasing difference in the world. It's talking about having only one culture, nothing to live or die for, no religions, no heaven above, no difference in belief. We can only all get together and get along if we erase our difference. And problem is that I think it's exactly the opposite, that the only way that we'll ever get along as people is to acknowledge difference and celebrate that difference. And then, as Avraham said, so who are we? Let's go back to our sense of identity. And it's that idea of trying just to be human without being something other than human, some type of human, is like the, the pear, the fruit, right? The pear or the apple that wanted to stop being a pear because he wanted to be a fruit. And the fact is that fruits come in different types. There isn't no such thing as a fruit that isn't a pear or an apple, an orange, or some type of fruit. And we might say, well, people aren't like that. Obviously, biologically, we are indeed all human, but culturally, we are not. There's no such thing. If you want to talk about the most, non-particularistic humans, so you talk about somebody who's part of economic globalization and speaks English. Well, that's not a very progressive vision of multiculturalism or diversity. That is, again, one of these quasi-fascist ideologies of erasing difference and simply adopting one language that belongs to one people that has managed to succeed for all kinds of reasons. 100 years from now, will we all be speaking English because of American superiority? Not necessarily. Maybe we should all start learning Mandarin Chinese if we want that. But the fact is that I personally have a lot of sympathy and enthusiasm for small cultures around the world who are battling to defend their own identities and their own languages. Many of them derive inspiration from Israeli culture, from the fact that we did revernacularized a language. We took a language that was a literary language or that didn't exist in the street and in the home, and we have revived it in that way to make it very vital. And there are plenty of cultures in the world who want to do that. And so it's, as you can say, it's very important to support those efforts, but let's support our own effort as well, right? I mean, I don't think Hebrew is endangered in that way, but Hebrew is part of Jewish cultural distinctiveness wherever, I think is completely central. Now, how to communicate that in the particular language of whether it be millennials or youngers and using social media and the appropriate thing, I'll leave that to the talented pedagogues and Hebrew teachers, but it has to be there. It has to be part of the agenda. You can't just say, oh, well, that's not important. We have a very limited time. We need to focus on other things. It needs to be up there in the priorities.
Deborah Taubman raised an interesting question. It's directed to Avraham, but certainly Jeremy, if you want to weigh in as well. She wants to really understand your point a little bit deeper, what it means to know Hebrew. I mean, I certainly know that, going back to the Pew study, one of the other questions they asked people, how many people know Hebrew? And 52% said they knew Hebrew, which we understand probably meant they know how to decode to some extent to 22 characters. But they would never say that they actually understood it. On the other hand, they would never say, oh, I know Spanish, because they can decode those same 26 letters that they're familiar with English. So Avraham, Deborah wants to push you a little. What would be the criteria for you, for them to know, to say they knew Hebrew, if it wasn't just, if it's clearly beyond just decoding or being able to recite with minimal understanding liturgy?
Well, that's a very, very long question, and it takes a major issue. It's the same as any language. What do you mean when you say you know English? I know English because I can buy fruit in English in a fruit store, maybe. Maybe I know English because I can read and understand a difficult English text. Maybe I know English because I love Shakespeare, and when I read it in the translation, it makes no sense to me. It has to be in the original. It's the same with a language. There are different ways in which people are going to know this language, depending on the ways in which they want to identify themselves as parts of this Jewish people. But I did make the distinction between teaching and educating. teaching Hebrew, there are phenomenal systems out there to teach the language, both conversational and otherwise. But to educate towards the language is to help people build a unique type of identity, which they will feel that they cannot do without Hebrew as a part of it.
I want to provide you, first of all, thank you. As someone who has enjoyed getting to know Jeremy over the last period of time, and as someone who, like Jeremy, counts myself as one of your disciples, Avraham, it has been such a pleasure to be in this conversation. I'm wondering if you can both share with us any final thoughts on what gives you hope about the possibility for making Hebrew more meaningful in the Jewish lives of those Jews that live here in America.
A big, bold dream. I don't know if I have hope. That's being too optimistic. But if I could wave a magic wand, I would send shlichim from Israel only to early childhood institutions with a total instruction, never use any other language than Hebrew. Why? Look at kids who grow up in homes with Spanish maids. They pick up language very, very easy. Now, not because I think that knowing that kind of language suffices, but if we could get rid of this nonsense of making it so difficult to understand the language, we could leave years of Jewish education that now we spend in helping people not understand the language. We can do far more deeper things with the Hebrew language than we are doing at the moment. So I believe emphasis on early childhood education in the Hebrew language let's get rid of that. Possibly of that thing that can possibly be gotten rid of, which is understanding the language. Once I have that key, I can understand prayer, and I can understand literature, I can understand mythology, and I can understand anything else. Let's get rid of that issue of understanding it. It's got to be done in early childhood. That's where people learn how to understand.
That's almost certainly true pedagogically.
I didn't answer your question intentionally because I don't have much hope.
I think that you asked, I mean, I guess on some level, what gives me hope? I think that there's so many things about Judaism that are just sort of changing before our eyes, that identities are being reshuffled, where all of us are, I think, are reevaluating what works. And if this wasn't true just in the last 3 to 5 to 10 years, it's certainly true just in the last 2 months, right? Of what works in terms of creating communal structures that support people, what kinds of content are people looking for, and what can we deliver, and stuff like that. And I think that those deep, to use that word again, roots of the Hebrew language and the authenticity of it, of the fact that it's connected to all these different corners of Jewish identity, I just sort of want to think that that's going to win people over. You know, when some people ask me why I made Aliyah, why I moved to Israel, the serious answer is that I moved to Israel because I really wanted to live in a Hebrew-speaking culture, and I thought that is simply key to who I am and who I wanted to be and how I wanted to raise my family. And if nothing else, and there's a lot of other things part of Israeli culture that I love, but if nothing else, just to raise my children as native Hebrew speakers would be, I think, my greatest gift to them. I don't know if they agree now at their age, but I still believe that. And my other answer I gave is that I thought, growing up in a Zionist movement, that Israel was a far too important experiment for the Jewish people to leave up to those Israelis. The DIBS, as we used to call it, of course, stands for Dear Israeli Brothers. Some people think it stands for something else. And I think the same can be said for Hebrew. It's too important to leave up to the Israelis. It's too much of a part of everything else, as we said. Ideally, if we could, I would, Avraham talked about shlichim. I would take about 4 million Israeli shlichim and spread them out in the diaspora, and take 4 million diaspora Jews and bring them to live in their houses, do a kind of, house exchange. And then Israelis would learn what it's like to live in the diaspora, and that would be an amazing contribution to their Jewish identity. But the Americans, or the diaspora Jews living in Israel, would have that unmediated exposure. Again, given the time and the other mashber that we're in, right, the corona situation, so we can't see a lot of intercontinental air travel going on anytime soon, and that's a problem. Here I'll end perhaps with my favorite Hebrew word, which is davka. Okay, and it's one of my favorite Hebrew words, not only because it's so hard to translate, so I love little gems of language like that are just unique to their own culture. But I think that it really is appropriate in this particular situation. Why Hebrew? Why now? Why should it be part? Davka, because how you guys can help me out in trying to translate why? Because even in spite of the fact that it might seem like it is even that much more challenging or that much more difficult, Dafka now is when it makes the most sense, or could have the most value.
I have to tell you what gives me hope is that we have two brilliant thought leaders like you that spend so much time thinking about this and writing about this and leading others through your own dugma and really helping us think about this in a deep and multi-valent way. I cannot thank you enough for joining us at Hebrew at the Center for this conversation. And I want to turn it over to our partners at Hebrew College, the president of Hebrew College, Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld, to bring us to a close.
I'd just like to thank Jeremy for being my partner in this discussion. I've learned so much from you. Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, I'm happy to have contributed back for having learned so much for you over the decades, Avraham. You've been very much a mentor of mine. So thank you.
And I want to thank both of you for an absolutely fascinating conversation, and really such a rich and thoughtful exchange. And thank you to Hebrew at the Center for this Sicha and this whole series of Sichot on a series of conversations about Hebrew language, and the Jewish experience. We at Hebrew College are so thrilled to be partnering with you in this effort, and also to be partnering with you in our joint courses in digital pedagogy for Hebrew teachers. Look forward to continuing that effort. Just a couple of words. The commitment to Hebrew language has been central to the mission of Hebrew College since we opened our doors in the fall of 1921. So we're approaching our centennial, and as we look towards that in the fall of 2021, I really see the centrality of the Hebrew language actually grow in new and vital ways, growing in new and vital ways. Some of the conversation touched on the question of the relationship between the Hebrew of the sources and the spoken Hebrew of contemporary Israeli experience. And I will just say that we have found in our curriculum for our pluralistic rabbinical school, which is really the fastest growing rabbinic program in the country, that one of the things that has been so compelling about it to prospective students is that the curriculum is designed to empower rabbis and educators to genuinely become insiders to the textual tradition, which enables them in turn to invite others into that as a living tradition, and into it not only as inheritors, but as innovators, as active creative participants. And in a very deep sense, the whole interpretive tradition that we are trying to invite people into is itself a sicha, is itself a conversation that spans millennia. And we know that Hebrew literacy is absolutely vital to those who wish to truly enter that conversation as fully and as creatively as possible. So that has just become underscored for us in such a significant way over the last 20 years. But we also see this in our community education programs, which now serve about 2,500 teens and adults in the greater Boston area. And here's a note that gives me hope, which is that we are finding a growing number of learners of all ages who are coming to us looking for, yes, high quality content in general and connection through learning, but also specifically who want to study Hebrew because they understand something of what Jeremy and Avraham have been speaking to, and specifically what Avraham said about the way in which the language carries and conveys cultural content and concepts. And I would say to that also the way in which it carries feeling and carries sort of the music of our people. So this is really the note that I want to just emphasize in terms of our work that is implicit, I think, in so much of what Jeremy and Avraham said today. That Hebrew language is such a vital thread in the fabric of our life as a people, that it ties us to each other over vast distances of both time and space. And I think in this season of mashber, of both crisis and the opportunity for new birth, I think so many of us are more acutely aware than ever of the need to grab hold of those threads that tie us to each other. And that keep the conversation, keep the Sicha going. So the final note I'll just touch on it, because I'm so moved by your exchange about the importance of this question, not only as a Jewish question, but as a human question. And Avraham, you made a passing comment at the beginning about that Americans have a problem not only with Hebrew, but with English. And, you know, my husband likes to say in every joke, there's a little bit of humor. So I think it's a very serious comment you made. And I experienced the fight for Hebrew as a fight for the beauty and vitality and richness of language in general. And we're living in a time where language is being so flattened. And so there's a way in which, you know, our fight to hold on to the music and feeling and concepts that are carried by Hebrew, I think is so critical. So we're so grateful to Hebrew at the Center for the privilege really of partnership around this work. We're grateful to everyone who participated in this conversation. I want to take a minute to remind everyone about the next conversation on Thursday, May 21st at 8:30 p.m. on Hebrew culture and identity. And I also want to just give a shout out to all the dedicated Hebrew language teachers on this call and everywhere who are so really, thank you for all you are doing to keep the Hebrew language alive, befinu uvelibenu, in our mouths and in our hearts. Toda.
Toda rabba, Sharon. Toda rabba, everyone, for joining us. And thanks for Sharon, in particular, for the special shout out to the essential workers of our people, the teachers of Hebrew.
First responders.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.